The first-class cabin carried the kind of silence money often creates. Soft lights glowed along the ceiling in perfect rows, reflecting gently against polished armrests and untouched leather seats. Outside the aircraft windows, the morning sky stretched pale and silver over the runway while airport workers moved carefully beneath the wings like distant figures inside a controlled machine. Inside the cabin, everything felt expensive without trying to. Quiet confidence. Measured movements. Controlled voices. Passengers settled into their seats with the ease of people accustomed to comfort. A businessman adjusted the sleeve of his tailored navy jacket. A woman placed her designer handbag carefully beside her shoes before scrolling through her phone. Another passenger leaned back with noise-canceling headphones already covering his ears. Everything about the cabin suggested the same invisible rule. People here belonged here. Then the man in the dark jacket stepped inside. No one noticed him at first. There was nothing dramatic about the way he entered. No security. No assistant. No attention following him. Just a quiet man carrying a small travel bag over one shoulder, walking with calm patience through the narrow aisle. His clothes looked ordinary. Dark jacket. Plain shirt. Worn boots. Slightly tired eyes. The kind of appearance most people stop seeing after 2 seconds. And that was exactly why almost nobody looked twice. He paused briefly near the front of the cabin and checked his boarding pass. A flight attendant smiled politely. "Good morning, sir." The man returned a small nod. "Morning." His voice was calm. Gentle. Almost quiet enough to disappear into the sound of boarding announcements overhead. Then he continued down the aisle. Row 2. Window seat. He stopped beside it. But someone was already occupying more than his own space. In the aisle seat sat a man who carried wealth the way some people carry authority. Expensive watch. Tailored charcoal suit. Perfect posture. A silver briefcase positioned carefully beneath the seat in front of him. He looked like someone who believed first class was not simply a ticket category. It was proof. His name was Richard Halston. And Richard Halston immediately noticed one thing. The man standing beside him did not fit the picture in his head. The quiet traveler reached gently toward the overhead compartment. "Excuse me," he said softly. Richard leaned slightly away. Not enough to seem openly rude. Just enough to create distance. The traveler carefully placed his bag above. Then he looked down at the seat. "That's my seat," he said calmly. Richard glanced at the boarding pass. Then at the man. Then back at the boarding pass. A faint crease formed between his eyebrows. "Your seat," he repeated. "Yes." "The window?" The man nodded. Richard studied him again. Longer this time. Not curiosity. Evaluation. The jacket. The shoes. The worn edges of the travel bag. The quietness. And somewhere during that silent inspection, Richard made a decision about who this man was. "There must be some mistake," Richard said. The traveler remained calm. "I don't think so." Richard leaned back slowly. "This is first class." "I know." The simplicity of the answer irritated him immediately. Because there was no embarrassment in it. No apology. No discomfort. Only certainty. And certainty from someone Richard had already dismissed felt strangely offensive. He pulled his legs back just enough to allow the man through. The traveler stepped carefully past him and sat beside the window. For a moment, it looked like the situation would end there. It should have. But pride rarely leaves quietly once it feels challenged. Richard adjusted his cuffs slowly. Then finally said the thing he had already decided the moment he saw him. "You don't really look like someone who belongs here." The words were not loud. But they were loud enough. A woman nearby stopped reaching into her purse. A younger passenger lowered one side of his headphones. Even a flight attendant glanced subtly toward row 2. The traveler turned his head slightly. His face remained calm. "Looks can be misleading," he said. Richard gave a thin smile. "Sometimes," he replied. Silence spread quietly through the row. The traveler looked out the window for a brief moment before speaking again. "I'm not trying to bother anyone," he said. "I just want to sit down." Again, that should have ended it. But Richard had already crossed a line internally. And once people begin defending their assumptions, they often become more loyal to them than to the truth. He pressed the call button above his seat. A soft chime echoed through the cabin. The traveler looked at the button. Then back out the window. A few seconds later, a flight attendant approached. Her name tag read Emily. She smiled professionally. "How can I help you, sir?" Richard gestured slightly beside him. "I need another seat." Emily glanced between both men. "I'm sorry to hear that. Is there an issue?" "Yes," Richard replied. "The issue is who I'm sitting next to." The atmosphere shifted immediately. Not loudly, but unmistakably. Emily's smile softened into caution. "Sir," she said carefully, "both seats are assigned." Richard nodded. "I understand that." His eyes drifted toward the traveler. "But I paid for a certain standard." The traveler remained silent. That silence bothered Richard even more. Emily kept her tone professional. "All passengers in first class have valid tickets, sir." Richard exhaled slowly. "That's not what I mean." The traveler finally turned toward him. "You don't know anything about me," he said quietly. Richard met his eyes. "I know enough." And in that moment, the cabin changed. Not because of shouting. Not because of drama. But because everyone around them understood exactly what was happening. Emily hesitated, then looked toward the traveler. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" The man handed it over immediately. "Of course." She checked it. Row 2. Window seat. First class. Everything matched. "Your seat is correct," she said. Richard frowned. "Check again." Emily looked uncomfortable now. "Sir." "Check the system." His voice sharpened slightly. "I'm not spending 6 hours sitting beside someone who clearly doesn't belong here." The traveler lowered his eyes briefly. Not in shame. In restraint. Emily glanced around the cabin. Passengers were watching openly now. Boarding had slowed. The aisle behind them was beginning to clog with uncomfortable silence. "I'll get my supervisor," she said carefully. Richard nodded once. "Please do." Emily walked toward the front of the aircraft. The traveler remained completely still beside the window. Richard adjusted his watch. "This could have been avoided," he muttered. The traveler turned slightly. "Yes," he said softly. Richard frowned. Something about the answer unsettled him. A moment later, Emily returned with another crew member. Older. Calmer. Sharper eyes. Her name tag read Clara, and the second she stepped into row 2, the atmosphere changed again. "Good morning," Clara said. "I understand there's a seating concern." Richard straightened. "There is." Clara nodded. "Please explain." Richard gestured openly toward the traveler now. "This man is assigned beside me," he said. "And frankly, I find that difficult to believe." Clara's eyes moved briefly toward the traveler. Then back. "And why is that?" she asked calmly. Richard exhaled through his nose. "Because this is first class." Clara's expression remained steady. "Yes," she said. "And all passengers here deserve respect." Richard's jaw tightened. That's not what I meant. Then clarify. The cabin went quieter. Richard could still step back. Still soften. Still recover. But pride rarely retreats when it has an audience. He leaned slightly forward. Fine, he said. He looks cheap. The sentence landed heavily across the cabin. No subtlety anymore. No disguise. Just judgment, and for the first time since boarding began, Clara's expression changed. Sir, she said firmly. That is not acceptable. The traveler remained silent beside the window. And somehow, his silence carried more dignity than anything Richard had said all morning. Clara extended her hand. May I see your boarding pass, sir? The traveler handed it over calmly. Of course. Clara checked the boarding pass. Then opened the digital manifest on her tablet. Emily leaned slightly closer. Clara scrolled. Row number. Seat assignment. Passenger details. Then suddenly, her finger stopped. Emily noticed immediately. What is it? She whispered. Clara looked at the screen again. Then slowly lifted her eyes toward the traveler. This time differently. Recognition. Emily looked down at the screen too. And her face changed immediately. Richard saw both reactions. His confidence flickered. What? He asked. Clara straightened slightly. The seat is confirmed, she said. Richard frowned. And? Clara looked directly at him. Mr. Reeves is seated correctly. Silence. Complete silence. The name traveled quietly through the cabin. Reeves. Keanu Reeves. Richard slowly turned toward the man beside the window. And suddenly everything looked different. The same jacket. The same boots. The same calm posture. But now Richard's assumptions collapsed beneath the weight of recognition. He swallowed. You're. Keanu gave a faint nod. Yes. Richard stared at him. The embarrassment arrived instantly. Violent. Hot. Public, but what disturbed him most wasn't that he had insulted a celebrity. It was realizing how differently he would have behaved if he had known from the beginning. And somewhere deep inside himself, Richard understood something uncomfortable. The problem had never been who Keanu was. The problem was who Richard believed deserved respect before knowing anything at all. And for the first time that morning, Richard had no idea what to say. The silence after Clara spoke his name felt heavier than any confrontation that had happened before it, not because the cabin suddenly respected the man beside the window, but because they realized they already should have. Richard sat frozen in the aisle seat. His expression no longer carried certainty, only shock. Across the aisle, a passenger slowly lowered his phone. Behind them, a woman exchanged a glance with her husband. Even Emily, the younger flight attendant, looked different now. Not nervous anymore. Just quietly aware of what this moment truly meant. Keanu Reeves sat calmly beside the window, his hands resting loosely in his lap. He did not smile. He did not look triumphant. He did not enjoy Richard's embarrassment. And somehow that made the situation even more painful. Because grace has a strange way of exposing people more clearly than anger ever could. Richard cleared his throat. I didn't realize. Keanu turned his head slightly. Most people don't, he said softly. There was no sharpness in the answer. No accusation. Just truth. Clara straightened slightly. Mr. Reeves has every right to remain in his assigned seat, she said calmly. Richard nodded too quickly. Yes. Of course. Obviously. The confidence in his voice had vanished. Emily offered Keanu a small apologetic smile. Can I get you anything before departure, sir? A water would be nice, Keanu replied. Of course. As Emily stepped away, Clara gave Richard one final look, not hostile, not judgmental, but firm. Then she turned and walked back toward the front of the cabin. Boarding slowly resumed. Passengers began moving again. Bags lifted into overhead compartments. Seatbelts clicked. Conversations restarted carefully. But row 2 remained suspended in something heavier. Richard stared forward, unable to relax, unable to escape the memory of his own words. You look cheap. The sentence replayed in his head like a stain he couldn't wipe away. Beside him, Keanu looked out the window. Completely calm, that calmness unsettled Richard more than anger would have. Because anger would have allowed defense. Calm only allowed reflection. The aircraft door closed with a heavy mechanical sound. A few seconds later, the safety announcement began overhead. Richard finally spoke again. I really am sorry. Keanu turned slightly. For what part? The question hit harder than Richard expected. He opened his mouth. Then stopped. Because suddenly he realized the answer mattered. The assumption, he admitted quietly. And the way I spoke to you. Keanu watched him for a moment. Then nodded once. Richard swallowed. I judged you before I knew anything about you. Yes, Keanu replied. Again, no anger. Only honesty. The aircraft slowly pushed back from the gate. Outside the window, airport lights drifted backward across the glass. Inside the cabin, Richard sat with a discomfort no luxury seat could soften. He had spent years believing he understood people quickly. That instinct was intelligence. That confidence was accuracy. But now, sitting beside the very man he had publicly humiliated, something inside him felt cracked open. Not destroyed. Exposed. The plane began taxiing toward the runway. Richard adjusted his watch. Then his sleeve. Then his tie. Small nervous movements. Keanu noticed. But said nothing. After another long silence, Richard spoke again. You could have said who you were immediately. Keanu looked out the window. I could have. Why didn't you? Keanu thought for a moment before answering. Because respect shouldn't depend on recognition, the sentence landed quietly. But Richard felt it immediately. Because deep down, he knew that was exactly what had happened. If he had recognized Keanu from the beginning, he would have smiled. He would have been polite. He would have bragged about sharing a row with him. Nothing about Richard's morality would have changed. Only his awareness of status. And that realization embarrassed him more than the public humiliation itself. The aircraft paused briefly near the runway. Engines deepened. A low vibration spread through the cabin. Richard stared forward. I think that's the part bothering me most, he admitted. Keanu glanced toward him. What part? That I only felt ashamed after I knew your name. Keanu held his gaze calmly. That's an important thing to notice, he said. Richard nodded slowly. The plane accelerated suddenly. Passengers pressed gently into their seats as the aircraft raced down the runway. Outside the window, lights blurred into long streaks. When the plane lifted. The city fell away beneath them. And somewhere during that climb into the sky, Richard felt something else falling too. His certainty. The aircraft leveled slowly through the clouds. Outside, the world became distant and abstract. Roads disappeared. Buildings dissolved into patterns. The earth itself looked quieter from above. Inside first class, the tension had softened into something stranger. Reflection. Passengers settled into their seats. A man opened a laptop. Someone requested coffee. A woman across the aisle closed her eyes beneath a cashmere blanket. Life inside the cabin continued. But row 2 remained different. Richard stared ahead for several minutes before speaking again. When I first looked at you, he admitted quietly, I didn't really see you. Keanu turned slightly toward him. Richard continued. I saw an interruption. A pause. A problem. Keanu listened without interruption. Richard rubbed his palms together slowly. That's hard to admit out loud. Keanu nodded once. Most honest things are. Richard gave a faint, uneasy breath. I keep replaying the moment in my head, he said. The confidence I had while being completely wrong. Keanu looked at him calmly. People are often most confident when they're making assumptions, he said. Richard frowned slightly. Why? Because assumptions remove uncertainty. The answer settled between them. Richard leaned back in his seat. He had spent most of his adult life making quick decisions. Quick evaluations. Quick judgments. In business, people praised that quality. They called it instinct. Leadership. Confidence. But sitting 30,000 feet above the earth, he was beginning to wonder how much of that confidence had simply been arrogance wearing a polished suit. A flight attendant passed by with drinks. Emily stopped beside them. Still water, Mr. Reeves. Thank you. She handed him the glass carefully. Then looked toward Richard. Anything for you, sir? Richard hesitated. Just water. Emily nodded and moved on. Richard watched her leave, then finally said something he hadn't expected to admit. I think I've confused status with value for a long time. Keanu remained quiet, giving him space to continue. If someone looked successful, I treated them differently, Richard admitted. If someone looked ordinary, I assumed things about them immediately. He stared down at his hands. And I never questioned it. Keanu looked out the window again. Clouds drifted slowly beneath the aircraft like endless white oceans. Most systems teach people to do that, he said quietly. Richard turned toward him. That sounds depressing. It can be. Another silence settled. But it no longer felt hostile. It felt honest. Richard finally asked the question that had been sitting heavily inside him. Does it bother you? Keanu glanced toward him. What? The way people judge you before knowing you. Keanu considered the question. Then answered carefully. It used to. Richard waited. But eventually I realized something, Keanu continued. People usually reveal themselves faster than they reveal you. Richard absorbed that slowly. Because today had proven it perfectly. Every cruel sentence he spoke had exposed his own thinking more than Keanu's worth. And now there was nowhere left to hide from that truth. Hours passed quietly. The conversation between them continued in slow waves. Not constant. Not dramatic. Just honest. Richard admitted things he rarely admitted even to himself. How success had made him impatient. How wealth had quietly distorted the way he viewed people. How often he mistook confidence for intelligence. And through it all, Keanu never lectured him. Never humiliated him. Never tried to win. He simply listened. Then answered truthfully. That made the reflection harder. Because kindness leaves people alone with themselves. And sometimes that is the most uncomfortable place to be. By the time the captain announced their descent, the emotional atmosphere inside row 2 had transformed completely. The earlier arrogance was gone. The humiliation had faded. What remained was awareness. Outside the window, the city below slowly returned into focus. Roads. Cars. Buildings. Movement. The aircraft descended through pale morning light. Richard looked out the window quietly. I think this flight changed something in me, he admitted. Keanu remained calm beside him. Only if you let it, he replied. Richard nodded slowly. I don't want to go back to being the person I was this morning. Keanu looked at him for a moment. Then notice before deciding, he said. Richard repeated the sentence quietly. Notice before deciding. The plane lowered further. Seatbelts tightened across the cabin. Flight attendants completed final checks. Richard finally turned fully toward Keanu. I'm sorry, he said again. But this time I don't mean because you're famous. I mean because you're a person. And I forgot that first. Keanu held his gaze calmly. Then nodded once. Thank you, he said softly. The wheels touched the runway moments later. A low roar filled the cabin as the aircraft slowed. Passengers relaxed. Phones appeared. Overhead bins clicked open. But row 2 remained still. Richard stared ahead quietly. He had boarded the flight believing status determined value. He left it understanding something far more difficult. Character reveals itself most clearly in moments where nobody believes they need to be kind. The aircraft rolled toward the terminal. Sunlight spilled across the cabin windows. Finally, Richard stood slowly from his seat. He looked down toward Keanu one last time. Thank you for not humiliating me back there, he said. Keanu gave a faint smile. That wouldn't have helped either of us. Richard nodded. Then quietly walked toward the exit. Not carrying the same version of himself who had boarded hours earlier. Keanu remained seated beside the window for another moment, watching the terminal lights outside. Calm as ever. Eventually he stood too, picked up his small worn bag, and stepped into the aisle. Most passengers barely noticed him leave. But one thing had changed forever inside that cabin. Not because a celebrity had been recognized, but because, for a few difficult hours above the clouds, one man had finally learned the difference between seeing status and seeing humanity. And long after the aircraft emptied, that lesson remained behind like an echo inside row 2. Quiet. Simple. Permanent. Passengers slowly moved through the jet bridge beneath soft airport lighting. Business calls resumed. Phones lit up. Rolling luggage echoed across the narrow floor. The world outside the aircraft had already returned to normal. But Richard Halston did not feel normal anymore. He walked several steps ahead of Keanu before slowing unexpectedly. Something inside him resisted simply leaving. Not because he wanted forgiveness. Not because he wanted another conversation. Because for the first time in years, he felt unfinished. People passed around him quickly. Airport staff moved efficiently through the corridor. Announcements echoed faintly from the terminal beyond. Richard stepped aside near the entrance and waited. A few moments later, Keanu emerged from the jet bridge carrying the same small bag over his shoulder. Still calm. Still unnoticed by most people. Richard looked at him. You really travel alone? He asked quietly. Keanu gave a small nod. Most of the time. No assistance? Not today. Richard almost smiled. That's hard for me to imagine. Keanu tilted his head slightly. Why? Richard looked around the terminal. Because if I had your level of success, he admitted, I think I'd want everyone to know it. Keanu studied him for a moment. That sounds exhausting, he said softly. The honesty of the answer made Richard laugh quietly for the first time all day. Not loudly. Not arrogantly. Just honestly. They began walking slowly through the terminal together. Nobody paid much attention. And strangely, Richard noticed something uncomfortable again. People treated Keanu almost exactly the same way they had treated him on the plane before recognizing him. Indifference. A quick glance. Then dismissal. It unsettled him now in a way it never would have before. Because now he understood how often people confuse visibility with value. They reached baggage claim. Richard adjusted the strap of his expensive leather bag. "Can I ask you something?" Keanu nodded. "Do situations like that happen often?" Keanu thought about it briefly. "More than people think." Richard frowned. "And it doesn't make you angry?" "It makes me aware." "Of what?" Keanu watched the luggage carousel begin moving slowly. "Of how people behave when they think kindness is optional." Richard lowered his eyes. The sentence hit deeply. Because that was exactly what had happened. He had treated respect like something conditional. Something earned through appearance. Through status. Through recognition. Not something every person deserved automatically. A suitcase rolled past. Then another. Richard leaned lightly against the railing. "I keep thinking about how easy it was for me to dismiss you," he admitted. Keanu remained quiet. Richard continued. "It happened instantly. Before I even heard your voice." Keanu nodded once. "Most judgments happen before conversations do," he said. Richard exhaled slowly. "That's terrifying." "It should be." Again, no comfort. No softening. Only truth. And strangely, Richard appreciated that more now. Because he realized something important. Growth doesn't happen through comfort. It happens through honesty. A young airport employee suddenly glanced toward Keanu. Then froze. Recognition spread across his face. "Oh my God." The employee approached carefully. "Excuse me, are you Keanu Reeves?" Keanu smiled politely. "Yes." The employee's entire posture changed immediately. Excitement. Respect. Warmth. Richard watched the transformation happen in real time. And for the first time in his life, he saw it clearly. How quickly people upgraded humanity once fame entered the room. The employee asked nervously for a photo. Keanu agreed without hesitation. A few seconds later the young man walked away grinning. Richard stared after him thoughtfully. "That's exactly what you meant, isn't it?" he asked quietly. Keanu adjusted his bag. "What?" "How recognition changes behavior." Keanu nodded. Richard looked down. "I did the same thing." "Yes," Keanu replied gently. "No cruelty. Just acknowledgement." Richard rubbed his forehead slowly. "I don't think I realized how much of my thinking was automatic." Keanu looked at him calmly. "Most people don't realize it until something interrupts it." Richard gave a faint nod. "And today interrupted it." It did. The baggage carousel continued turning. Eventually a worn black duffel bag appeared. Keanu picked it up quietly. Richard looked surprised. "That's it?" Keanu smiled faintly. "It holds what I need." The simplicity of the answer lingered between them. Richard suddenly realized how much of his own identity depended on excess. Expensive watches. Designer luggage. Status symbols. So much effort spent trying to project importance. And somehow the quietest person he had met in years felt more secure than everyone else in the terminal. They began walking toward the exit. Outside the airport windows, rain had started falling softly across the pavement. Cars lined up beneath glowing terminal lights. Drivers waited beneath umbrellas. The city beyond looked gray and restless. Richard stopped near the sliding glass doors. "I don't think this was random," he said quietly. Keanu looked toward him. "What do you mean?" Richard gave a faint breath. "I think I needed this." Keanu remained silent for a moment. Then answered softly. "Most important lessons arrive disguised as uncomfortable moments." Richard nodded slowly. "You know," he admitted, "if I had recognized you immediately, I probably would have spent the entire flight trying to impress you." Keanu smiled slightly. That sounds exhausting too. Richard laughed again. This time easier. More human. A black luxury sedan pulled up near the curb. A driver stepped out holding an umbrella. Mr. Halston, the driver called politely. Richard looked toward the car. Then back toward Keanu. Can I ask one last question? Keanu nodded. Richard hesitated. How do you stay calm when people treat you unfairly? Keanu looked out toward the rain for several seconds before answering. Because if someone treats me badly before knowing me, he said quietly, that behavior belongs to their story before it belongs to mine. Richard absorbed the sentence completely. And suddenly he understood why Keanu had never looked embarrassed on the plane. The humiliation had never truly belonged to him. It belonged to the person creating it. Richard swallowed slowly. That's hard to learn. Keanu gave a small nod. Yes. Rain continued tapping softly against the terminal glass. For a moment neither man spoke. Then Richard extended his hand. Not performatively, not socially. Honestly. Keanu looked at the hand. Then shook it. Take care of yourself, Richard said quietly. You too. Richard nodded once. Then stepped toward the waiting sedan. But before entering the car, he paused. Because another realization had arrived. If he had never learned Keanu's identity, he might never have reflected at all. And that truth still disturbed him. He lowered himself slowly into the back seat. As the car pulled away from the airport, Richard stared out the rain-covered window in silence. Traffic lights blurred across the glass. People hurried along sidewalks beneath umbrellas. Ordinary strangers moved through ordinary lives. And for the first time in years, Richard found himself wondering how many people he had already judged without noticing. How many conversations he had entered carrying invisible assumptions. How many people he had quietly dismissed because they failed to match an image in his head. The realization exhausted him. But beneath the discomfort, something else existed too. Awareness. And awareness, he was beginning to understand, changes everything once it arrives. The city moved endlessly outside the tinted windows of Richard's car. Rainwater streaked across the glass in uneven patterns while traffic crawled slowly beneath gray afternoon skies. Normally Richard spent drives answering emails, reviewing contracts, managing problems. Today he sat in silence. His phone vibrated repeatedly beside him. He ignored it. Because for the first time in a very long time, his attention was not focused outward. It was focused inward. And that felt unfamiliar. The driver glanced briefly into the rearview mirror. Everything all right, sir? Richard stared out at the passing streets. Yes, he answered quietly. Then after a pause added, No. Not exactly. The driver nodded politely without asking more. Richard appreciated that. His thoughts returned again to the plane. To the exact moment he first saw Keanu standing beside the seat. How quickly judgment had formed. How automatic it felt. How justified he believed himself to be. And now, replaying it carefully, Richard noticed something disturbing. He hadn't simply assumed Keanu didn't belong. He had needed him not to belong, because the assumption protected something inside Richard's own identity. A hierarchy. A worldview. An invisible system where appearance determined worth. And suddenly he realized something terrifying. That system existed long before the flight. The plane had not created the behavior. It had only exposed it. Richard closed his eyes briefly. Memories surfaced. Restaurant staff he barely acknowledged. Employees he interrupted. Strangers he evaluated instantly. Not openly cruel. Never obviously hateful. Just quietly dismissive. The kind of behavior society often excuses because it hides beneath success. But now he saw it clearly. And clarity made ignorance impossible. Hours later, Richard arrived home. His penthouse overlooked the city skyline through enormous glass windows. Normally the view comforted him. Tonight it felt strangely empty. He loosened his tie slowly and walked toward the kitchen. Everything around him reflected success. Marble countertops. Modern art. Designer furniture. But for the first time in years, none of it felt impressive. Because he had spent so much energy building an image of success, while neglecting simpler things. Patience. Humility. Humanity. He poured himself water and stood quietly beside the window. Then his reflection caught his attention in the glass. And unexpectedly, he remembered something Keanu had said. People often reveal themselves faster than they reveal you. Richard stared at his own reflection for a long moment. Because now he understood. The flight had never truly revealed Keanu. It revealed Richard. And that realization changed him more deeply than embarrassment ever could. The next morning, Richard arrived at his office unusually early. Employees greeted him carefully as they always did. But something felt different now. Not about them. About him. He noticed things he normally ignored. The nervousness in a young assistant's posture. The exhaustion in the receptionist's eyes. The way security staff stood silently near the elevators without anyone acknowledging them. Tiny details. Human details. Things he once moved past automatically. By lunchtime, Richard realized something else. Awareness creates responsibility. Once you notice people clearly, continuing to treat them carelessly becomes a choice. And Richard no longer wanted to make that choice. Weeks passed. The memory of the flight never disappeared. But it changed shape over time. At first it felt humiliating. Then uncomfortable. Then educational. Eventually, it became something else entirely. A reference point. A quiet internal reminder before speaking. Before judging. Before deciding. Notice before deciding. The sentence stayed with him constantly. And slowly, almost invisibly, his behavior began changing. Not dramatically. Not performatively. Quietly. He listened longer during meetings. He interrupted less. He learned employees' names. He thanked people he once overlooked. Nobody around him understood the reason. But Richard understood. Transformation rarely announces itself loudly. Sometimes it begins silently inside one difficult moment 30,000 feet above the earth. And sometimes the person who changes your life never even tries to. Months later, Richard boarded another flight. First class again. Same polished cabin. Same soft lighting. Same quiet atmosphere of privilege. But this time, when an older man in worn clothes paused uncertainly beside his row searching for an overhead compartment, Richard immediately stood up. "Here," he said gently. "Let me help you with that." The man looked surprised. "Thank you." Richard smiled politely. "No problem." Then he sat back down slowly, and for the first time since that flight with Keanu Reeves, he felt something unexpected. Peace. Not because he had become perfect, but because he had finally begun paying attention. And somewhere high above the clouds months earlier, a quiet man beside the window had reminded him of something success alone could never teach. Every person carries a story you cannot see, and dignity should never depend on recognition.